to address the members of the European Parliament. At the time, a great wind of liberty was blowing over the continent, knocking down the walls in emancipating countries and giving renewed hope to nations and peoples. François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl presented 26 years ago. With the assistance of Jacques Delors, they presented action for solidarity, which was to be afforded in order to welcome in people. Refugees, people who were convinced that Western Europe would be a home for them, and all of Europe fell into place. And the hopes invested in them were substantial. The shared hopes of Kohl and Mitterrand would be that they would be creating union for Europe. In so doing, they would roll over the mandates of the founding fathers. An internal market with social rules. The project of a single currency, this was all part and parcel of the same process. And would be with the same resolve. Now, some 26 years on, Chancellor Angela Merkel and myself are here addressing this House again because of the 25th anniversary of the German reunification, but also because living through new tragedies and drama. And this poses the whole continent new challenges. To tell the truth, it's years now that Europe has been in a succession of crises, the financial crisis. It sprang outside this continent, but spread to this continent. And has brought in its wake an economic crisis, which we are now emerging from, and also a social crisis, with millions of young people out of the job and unemployed. Now there is a humanitarian crisis which we need to confront, with an influx of refugees caused by the destabilization of entire regions in the Middle East and Africa, because of outbreaks of warfare and religious hatred, and also security crises with war, which is not very far away, which is at the frontier of our frontier in Ukraine, and also terrorist attacks, which have affected several countries of our continent, including my own. With each crisis, fear appears. We need to live with fear, but we must not be dominated by those fears. And nonetheless, there is an inclination, a tendency, a temptation to retreat into our own national shells when there is a crisis, in a kind of beggar-my-neighbor attempt to avoid the problems. And that's what experience and history tells us. That is not the way.
Mais elles ne peuvent pas condamner l'Europe à la frilosité et à l'impuissance. Au contraire, elles justifient une Europe
François Hollande, French president, addressing the European Parliament, first addressed with Angela Merkel
et de tenir son rang conformément à ses intérêts et à ses valeurs, valeurs qui ont justifié l'unification de notre continent. Il n'y a donc pas d'autre solution qu'une Europe forte.
The only solution, he's saying, is a strong Europe to underpin our sovereignty and our shared sovereignty. Over the recent months and years, France and Germany have sought to find a common response to the aspects we've seen over the past period. We've responded by affirming simple, clear principles of solidarity, of responsibility, and of firmness. Since all of the attacks, he's talking about terrorism here, it's our way of life. and directed at the very soul and spirit of our continent. Can I thank the heads of state and government and the parliamentarians that came to Paris on the 11th of January to demonstrate their solidarity and also their attachment to liberty, to freedom, to what we stand for and what we represent, and to defend all of that from the terrorists whose only intention is to erode the cement that binds us. Hollande speaking in Strasbourg here if you're just joining us on Euronews. Refugees are victims of convulsions, of troubles in the Middle East, you say? European countries are suffering on the front line. They're bearing the brunt.
Qui accueille des réfugiés en grand nombre. Solidarité à l'égard de l'Afrique qui se bat pour son développement et pour éviter justement les mouvements de population. Alors, regardons les choses en face.
Looking at the issues surrounding refugees, we're confronted by an unprecedented arrival of refugees, many of them fleeing war and massacre, others looking for a better life. But all of them have endured terrible conditions at the mercy of unscrupulous traffickers. Too many of them have died in atrocious conditions. And now we've seen some of those faces. Those faces are imprinted in our memories. Europe has sought to first and foremost save lives, to fight against the traffickers thanks to Frontex and others. I recognize and acknowledge that Europe was slow in understanding the tragedy in the Middle East and in Africa. Europe did not take the measure of the hopes that are invested in it. Those who surrounded been on the receiving end and been looking for a light to steer by. Europe has not given sufficient. Europe has taken some time to organize itself, to live up to our reputation of welcoming people.
Avec la Commission européenne, et je salue ici le président Juncker, a mis sur pied un plan d'ensemble.
Now, President Juncker and the institutions have put into place a plan and back up Italy and Greece, who are on the front line and cannot be left alone with those responsibilities on their own. To help the countries in the Balkans, who are likewise transiting populations, in itself very difficult to cope with. Closer cooperation with Turkey is of the essence, and there are negotiations that have commenced there, and they must be concluded with clear rules, because it's in Turkey where refugees must be given reception, and in return we must provide Turkey with assistance if they're helping us, and ensure these refugees, whether they're in camps or in the population, are able to work, to feed their children, and have hope for the future themselves. If we fail to do that, then of course they are going to come here, and we must put in place reception and identification registration centres, and they must be respected. And there must be a distribution of asylum seekers within member states. That's what we've been seeking to do. And we've been able to do that, 160,000 of them. And we must ensure the rules are properly applied and obligations are delivered and respected. This plan must now be implemented quickly. These are the principles: solidarity, responsibility, same responsibility, the same values that can be applied. When we were looking at the Greek situation, where things were difficult, and Angela Merkel and myself did our bit with the Commission, with all the member states, those discussions could have floundered.
c'eût été un
And that would
abandon,
have been more than just a failure.
l'abandon d'un pays
And that
dont la
would have been a
culture et la
dereliction. We
civilisation
would have been
nous
abandoning a
étaient
country
encore.
whose civilization and
C'eût été la
culture
première
is
brèche
part of our own.
dans l'intégrité de la
This
zone
would have been
euro.
the first breach
Et d'autres pays
in the
auraient été sous
integrity
pression.
of the Eurozone.
Et puis, c'eût été une
And other
démission
countries would have come under pressure
devant nos
themselves.
responsabilités
And it
mutuelles,
would have been a resignation,
responsabilité européenne, responsabilité
an application
du
of
gouvernement
our
grec.
shared responsibility as
Les
Europeans
négociations ont
towards the
abouti
Greek government.
sur un programme global de réforme et un nouveau soutien
The
financier.
regulations and
Je
negotiations were
souhaite
brought
que
to
ça se
conclusion.
traduise maintenant par une
And
discussion
I now
sur le
hope
service de la dette.
this will
Ça
now
fait
lead
partie de la résolution
to a
d'ensemble.
debate about debt servicing. This is
Alexis
part of
Tsipras,
an
le
overall
Premier
solution.
ministre grec,
Alexis
a été
Tsipras, the
courageux
Greek Prime Minister,
et il a
has shown courage
voulu que son peuple puisse être consulté après
in his
signer
desire
l'accord.
to see his
Le
people
respect de la démocratie,
consulted
et je le dis ici,
before that
dans
agreement.
le lieu aussi
Now, I
de
say
la
that.
démocratie européenne. Le respect de la démocratie n'est jamais contradictoire avec le respect des règles
Respect for
communes.
democracy, asking that of the
Responsabilité,
people.
solidarité, toujours les mêmes principes.
They're the same
La
important principles.
responsabilité, nous devons aussi la démontrer contre le terrorisme. La vigilance doit être de mise.
Responsibility, we must bring that to bear against
Nous devons nous
terrorism.
doter des instruments
We need
indispensables
to equip ourselves with the necessary
de sécurité,
methods to ensure
dans le
our
respect des libertés.
security
La
services
France
can
a
do their
voté
job
une loi
in full respect to the
être
people's
capable
freedoms. France
de mieux
adopted a
connaître
law
les activités, de
in order
suivre
to be
les
able to
terroristes. Et l'Europe
follow more
doit
closely
également
terrorist
prendre sa part.
activity.
Et je
Europe
pense
must
au
itself
dossier trop
must
longtemps
show that it's
retardé
part of the
du PNR
responsibility.
européen.
And there are
Et je
dossiers
demande
that have been a
autant
long
qu'il est
time
possible
coming.
que le
Passenger
Parlement
name
européen
records, for
puisse
example,
adopter ce texte,
and it's
qui
essential
est
for the European
indispensable
Parliament to
si
adopt
nous
that
voulons
text,
agir.
which is indispensable if we are to be able to take action.
L'Europe a aussi un devoir de fermeté.
Europe also has a
Nous
duty
avons dû
to show
répondre à
a
une
resolve.
violation brutale
In Ukraine, we
droit
have responded
international.
to brutal
et
fighting,
prévenir une guerre
flouting of
aux
international law,
portes de notre continent.
and
Les
preventing
Européens
war at the gates of our
ont fait
continent
preuve d'unité.
is what we've been about.
Les 28
European countries have shown
dans la mise
unity
en œuvre de sanctions. Et il y a eu des
in
débats,
putting in place a regime of
légitimes
sanctions.
sur
There has been a
l'efficacité
debate,
et
a
la
legitimate debate,
durée de ce
of
mécanisme.
the effect and the duration of these sanctions.
L'Allemagne et la France se sont particulièrement engagés.
Germany and France have been particularly committed to that process
Et encore la semaine dernière,
in
Angela
concluding
Merkel et
and
moi-même,
implementing the Minsk agreement.
avec
And all last week,
président
Angela
russe
Merkel and myself,
et le
with
président
the Russian
ukrainien,
president
dans ce qu'on
and
appelle
Ukrainian
le
president
format Normandie, nous avons veillé non
in the
seulement
so-called Normandy format.
à faire respecter ce qui avait été conclu à Minsk, mais à éviter d'autres processus de séparation.
We were minded to respect the wording of the Minsk
Ce
agreements.
format-là, cette méthode-là,
The Normandy format, this method,
exercée au nom de l'Europe tout entière,
exercised on behalf of Europe,
efficace puisque les élections
has been
que les
particularly
séparatistes
effective
avaient projetées
since the
d'organiser
elections in which
au
the
milieu du mois
separatists
d'octobre ont
scheduled
été repoussées
for mid-October,
et que le
they've been
processus de
postponed.
Minsk a pu se poursuivre.
And that means
que
the
les
Minsk
armes légères ont pu
process
être
has been able
retirées,
to continue
bientôt
and carry
les
on,
armes lourdes,
and that
que la guerre
weapons
s'est
have
arrêtée
been withdrawn,
sans que
and
la
soon
paix soit encore revenue.
heavy artillery will follow.
Ce que nous sommes déterminés
Is
pour
relevant to
longtemps,
Europe
les
because
équilibres dans la région,
what's
dans
happening
toute
there
la
is will
région
determine for a long
du
time
Moyen-Orient.
the balance of
Si on nous
equilibria
laissons les
in that region
affrontements religieux
and right across the Middle East.
et parfois
If
entre
we
chiites
allow
et
religious
sunnites,
conflict
souvent,
between
toujours,
Shiite and Sunni,
depuis quelques mois ou quelques années,
and this has been the case
encore,
of months
ne
and
pensons
years,
pas que nous serons à
if we
l'abri.
allow this to grow further,
Ce sera une guerre
then don't think for one moment that we'll be protected.
qui pourra concerner
This will be
aussi
all-out war,
nos propres
which could
territoires.
well
Alors, nous devons agir.
spread to our own territory.
A pris ses
And we must
responsabilités
act.
militaires face à la menace.
France has shouldered its military responsibility in the face of those threats, and all of Europe must now do what it can
Nous devons
in
construire
humanitarian
ensemble avec tous ceux
and
qui peuvent
political,
y contribuer
economic
un avenir politique
terms
qui donne à
to
la
make a
population
contribution to the political future,
syrienne une autre alternative que
which
Bachar
brings a future for the Syrian people,
et c'est
an
notre devoir
alternative to
vis-à-vis
Bashar al-Assad
des
or
Syriens, et
Daesh.
c'est notre intérêt
And it's our duty,
comme Européens.
incumbent on us.
Et j'appelle
It's in our
tout le temps
best interest as well
à
as
faire
Europeans.
pression pour que cette transition politique puisse se faire.
And I send out this call to all
Et
Europeans
sachons bien,
so
quelles
that
que
we can
soient
help bring
les
about this
conditions
transition,
qu'il ne sera
in the
pas
knowledge
possible
that regardless of what the positions are here, it may not be get all of the moderate opposition on side when it comes to addressing the wars of the Syrian people. But we have to make sure everyone who has the will and good intentions, bringing in the United States, the Gulf states, Europe, all of us must lend our support to get a negotiated settlement, a political solution. We will have to demonstrate great solidarity towards others. This is why cooperation with the African countries is so essential. We'll have a summit in November between Africa and Europe in Malta, and it's about going into the root causes. The causes of departure, that people can be persuaded to remain in their own regions, in as far as trying to make it possible for them to have a livable home situation. We approach many subjects, which are all Europe-related, but all are different facets of the same one. As the debate rumbles between sovereignty and sovereigntists in a country, if we're talking about them in one country or sovereignty in Europe, are we going to be able to build on our commonality? Are we going to be divided? We don't need less Europe, we need more Europe. Europe must affirm itself, otherwise we will see the demands of Europe, meaning the return to national frontiers, the abandonment of the euro. François Hollande here, making an address to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. He's making an historic address with Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, who's sat alongside him. The last time these two leaders spoke, well, they haven't spoken together to this Parliament. This is the first time, but the last time German and French leaders spoke together in Strasbourg and addressed the Parliament was back in November 1989, when Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand spoke about the challenges facing Europe a few days after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So clearly, this first address from Angela Merkel and Hollande is historic today. He's now saying that sovereignty is in its decline now, and it's just as dangerous. Not providing hope to our populations, not being able to provide something together because of national interventions. Now, looking forward, I'm convinced we must go further, because otherwise we won't just stop. We will go backwards, and this will spell the end of the European project. And this is why I propose the Eurozone should be consolidated and now beefed up, as a basis for policies for convergence, for fiscal modernization, for combating tax dumping, and doing more than what we're already doing with the European plan. Institutional rejigging will be required if the Eurozone is to be governable, for the rules to be respected, for benefits to be brought for all. Those choices will be for the countries who are willing, with the parliamentary scrutiny ensuring overall coherence and scrutiny. We need also to strengthen what's called the Schengen area, because questioning freedom of movement for people and returning to internal borders would be a tragic error. Round of applause for remark from François Hollande. Any question that Schengen in its current form would help us deal with pressures on the perimeter would fall into another area. Our control of external frontiers involves enhanced cooperation with the frontline states, and it means putting in place a European Coast Guard and a European Border Guard service. as the President of the Commission has proposed. Tomorrow we must divide, we must come up with a coherent asylum policy, which comes up with a common list of safe countries, convergence of procedures and rights, which will provide greater protection. And that means a common asylum regime for the European Union and in all of its dimensions. There will be choices. Either we go forward or we go backwards. And going backwards would take us back to powerlessness. This courageous choice is one that we must forge ahead with. And in December next, the Paris conference, we will have an opportunity to salute Europe's pledges on the eve of that conference. It's been key to bringing the Chinese and the Americans on board, headed for the same agreement. It could have been more ambitious, no doubt, and it will need to be built up. There are too many countries still who haven't brought their contributions to the table, and we Europeans must be able to bring in the great carbon market that will give guidance to industry and steer them towards a more sustainable future. Let me salute and pay tribute to the European Parliament in those climate negotiations. Please continue to support the efforts being made by your countries and by Europe in its entirety for us to find our way to an agreement. This is an ambition that extends to our funding side as well, where the money comes from. We must get together $100 billion for the energy transition in the countries that are most vulnerable and the developing countries. We're not there yet. No, we're not. But we still have 2 months. And we need that agreement. We know that there's knowledge, and we recognize the responsibilities we will incur in the future generations. We will need a new conference to sort that out. We must be able to take our decisions on the day. And it's up to the governments. It's incumbent on European governments, first and foremost, and for those who gather in Paris to be mindful of their responsibilities invested in them by you. I hope I can come back to the European Parliament with the very least pride that we had a successful conference in Paris, but also that we were there on the day when the countries of the world, building on local and regional authorities on the world, will also be there. With all the associations and the organizations, businesses, trade unions, all of them together. They will be there, setting out the situation, solving a large part of the climate generation for a long time into the future. And that's a rendezvous we cannot miss. French President François Hollande making an address to the European Parliament in Strasbourg, if you're just joining us here on Euronews. We must also remember, he says, the needs of agriculture for food, security, and safe food. We need the same resolve in that area as well at the time of crisis. In certain types of agriculture produce, but in the member states and parliament also, we must look for the requisite backup to save our produce and protect those who are most vulnerable. Let me just say a word about the big debate with the United States. France wants those negotiations to represent progress. We want there to be guarantees for the identification of products, for designations of origin, for transparency, and to protect investment for dispute settlements. Must be part of the picture if we're going to get an outcome which brings benefits to all of our economies. Now let me conclude with a reflection, which is of concern to all of us here. I don't imagine that for one moment us here, our parliamentarians who are not European, and we don't belong to the same ensemble. We are bound together by the same shared values together.